Well, good afternoon. Welcome back to Storytime as we continue with Sam Campbell's series, his wildlife series. Book 2 is Too Much Salt and Pepper, published by Pacific Press. Glad you can join us again. Chapter 1, A Highly Seasoned Welcome. And some of you are missing her on Friday, so she's back. Late one May, when the magic of approaching evening was spreading over the North Country, there was a regal ceremony afoot in our forest sanctuary. Even a stranger to the region would have discovered as much had he looked or listened to the fuss and flurry which were taking place. The very air seemed to quiver with beauty and merriment. The sun was already in the afternoon sky, highlighting mountainous clouds which hung immobile at the horizon. And all the far-flung beauty of the heavens lived again in the mirrored lake. An old crow hurried across the brilliant sky. Maybe to some his cry would have sounded like the familiar caw-caw-caw. But to us who stood under a spell of the moment, it seemed he said, "Awake, awake! All you children of the forest, the party has begun." A belted kingfisher, perched on a barren bough, caught the spirit of the moment and playfully dived into the shallow water at the shore, uttering his raucous laughter as he rose on wing again. It was wonderful to see graceful birches and sturdy oaks primped in the gathering evening light, proudly displaying their tresses of newborn leaves. Tiny starflowers and dainty violets strutted and posed their prettiest on the woodland carpet. Pine trees stood still and straight to add dignity to the scene. Juneberry blossoms flung their white beauty against the flaming color of the sky. "Awake, awake! They have returned, the party has begun," cawed the old crow, and the sky became dotted with many of his kind echoing his call. Surely something of importance and great joy was happening. An olive-backed thrush wove his song into the stillness. High in the brilliant heavens, an eagle circled in effortless flight, gaining for himself a superior view of the festivities. An enormous old heron glided into a little bay and settled among the reeds, steadied himself on one stilt-like leg, and stood as if he had suddenly turned to stone. A chipmunk raced to a vantage point on an old stump, and a red squirrel perched on the limb of a wild cherry tree, chattering loudly as if by his voice he could rivet the wilderness together. Jenny and I stood at the shore of this little forest lake looking upon this elaborate ceremony. Jenny is Mrs. Sam Campbell. In her heart glows a love for the living and growing things of nature. Our canoe, loaded with luggage, floated where wavelets broke against the shore. Now we were ready to begin the last leg of our journey back to the sanctuary, our home. "The woods people need not have done all this just because we were coming home," said Jenny, referring to the carnival loveliness about us. "It is nice of them, but something simpler would have been sufficient. Just to tell us we are welcome." But the wild world only became more beautiful and laughed at her call for moderation. Nature deals in extravagance. Sunset hues deepened to gold. A soft breeze strummed on harps of pine trees, while linnets, white-throated sparrows, and grosbeaks sang into the still loveliness. Then into the scene came the clown, the joker, like the court fool of olden days. A loon flew low over the water like the winged arrow, uttering his half-hysterical cries and laughter. Without reducing his speed in the least, he dived directly into the lake, disappearing completely. Up he came now, swimming across the surface and beating the water with his wings, his cries more weird than ever. Alternately, he flew, dived, and swam in craziest manners, shrieking, calling, laughing wildly. His voice echoed along the lake shores. He answered the echo, and the echo answered him, until the region fairly vibrated with his voice. We laughed. This was a royal welcome indeed, and this bit of clowning by the loon added zest to it. And now, as we put out from shore in our canoe, gliding silently over what seemed to be a lake of gold, we knew well that there were more events of surprise and delight to come. Our canoe trail would lead us from this lake, whose shores we had reached by a narrow woods road, through a charming channel into another lake where no road had yet touched. In this second lake nestled a little tree-covered island, and upon it stood a cabin that was tiny too. This was the aim and end of our journey. Our hearts were beating hard when we rounded the last point of land, and the island came to view. It too had been prettied up by nature for our homecoming. The sun was a great ball at the western horizon. It peeked through the pine trees as if it were stealing one last look before retiring. Our clowning loon shot through the sky overhead, screaming in wild happiness. "He's just telling them all we have arrived," affirmed Jenny. "Certainly makes us feel important, doesn't it?" How we hoped that his calls would tell Minnie we had arrived. Those wooded shores about us were the homes of some very precious forest people. "There is a deer," exclaimed Jenny, pointing to the shadowed depths of the little bay. Could it be Babette? It could be Babette, though we could not know for sure. This was where Babette had lived when we knew her and petted her as a fawn. The woods back of the bay were sacred to us, too, for in them had lived Inky the porcupine. Inky, the old rascal porky, who had given us so many lessons and so many problems during the time we raised him and turned him loose in the forest. Inky of the sharp teeth, Inky of the many quills, Inky with the sense of humor that had made him an expert and adorable pet. Would he still be there, and would he know us? "And there is that high ridge of maple trees where we always thought Rack and Ruin lived," exclaimed Jenny excitedly, pointing to some distant groves. Yes, Rack and Ruin, our friendly raccoons, had lived somewhere in that region. Would they still be there, and would they know us? Would Sausage our woodchuck come back to be our friend again? Only the hours and days to come would give us our answers. But now we were approaching our island, and our eyes, ears, and thoughts strained with anticipation. "Oh, I wonder if Salt and Pepper are there," whispered Jenny hesitantly, as if she feared she might get the wrong answer. "What a climax it would be to all this wonderful welcome if we see them again." "I predict you will see plenty of them before this season is over, maybe too much," I replied, and my words were much truer than I had realized. 6 months before, we had left Salt and Pepper, 2 young porcupines then half a year of age, on our island. From the time they were 3 weeks old, they had been our pets. Our experience with Inky had given us an appetite for porky companionship. Inky alone had taught us many things of the character of his kind. We had found him intelligent and devoted to us, but we had learned nothing of the ways of porcupines with one another. Hence, when forest rangers offered us 2 baby porcupines, orphaned by a forest tragedy, we eagerly accepted them. Through that summer we had played with them, worked with them, watched them, until they were as deeply embedded in our hearts as Inky was. Then, when winter work called us, we had to leave them behind to their very own capable devices. But now it seemed that this might have occurred long ago. So many things had happened. Bobby, the grand lad who had been so much part of life at the sanctuary, had answered the call of his country, and with typical character and courage was flying with the Air Force. Jenny and I had traveled thousands of miles in public service and met thousands of people. But the memory of those 2 porcupines and their friendly devotion was still vivid with us. And that day, as we returned home, we wondered about these 2 creatures more than all the others. Would they be there on the island where we had last seen them? Would they know us? Would we still have the somewhat painful pleasures of bites from their sharp teeth and pricks from their needle-like quills? We had not long to wait for our answer. The island was now about 100 yards ahead of us. We scanned the shores carefully and strained our eyes looking at the tops of trees where our odd little pets had lived. Jenny could not resist the urge to call, "Salt and Pepper!" Her voice carried far in the silence. "Salt and Pepper, are you there?" We stopped paddling and listened. It seemed that everything else stopped and listened too. The whole forest was suddenly silent. Across the waters came the unmistakable call of a porcupine, emanating from the trees on our island. Then a second porcupine voice joined the first, and the 2 continued in ever-increasing excitement. How well we knew those voices, and the meaning of their tones. Those were the happy notes of our porky pets. The way they talked when they saw us on a trail, or took favorite food from our hands, or met us at our doorway in early morning. It was the kind of call they used to awaken us in the middle of the night when we would rather have been allowed to sleep. When the call that made us leave the dinner table to feed or play with those pestersome but precious porcupine pets. Yes, Salt and Pepper were on the island waiting for us. They had met the many problems of the winter, proved their independence of our help, and yet had not forgotten us. And the miracle of it was that they remembered our voices. In no other way could they have identified us that evening of our return. It was not possible that they could have seen us so far away, nor could they have caught our scent, as there was no breeze to carry it to them. Only the call Jenny had made gave them news of our coming. But they knew her voice and associated with it the many happy events of our months together. Events which must have been as enjoyable for them as for us. Needless to say, we increased our pace. Our paddles set the image of the sky to rocking, and the canoe bow cut through the reflection of the sunset. Constantly the porcupines called to us, their voices conveying excitement in ever-rising pitch. They became still more excited as we called back in their language, and let it be said, we can talk pretty good porcupinese. When we reached the island and guided the canoe into the shoreline sands, Salt and Pepper were at the water's edge to meet us. They could not wait for us to land. With uncontrolled enthusiasm, they climbed over the bow of the canoe, over the luggage, and all over us. What a welcome it was! We were smothered and monopolized with porcupine caresses, gone for a time were all the poetic thoughts, wasted all the beauty of that forest festival. All we could see were those excited, animated bundles of quills and hair climbing up our arms, on our shoulders, and all over our heads. All we could feel were those strong porcupine claws gripping and scratching our necks and faces, while chisel-like teeth nibbled at our heads and ears. Grunty talk of jubilant porcupines was mingled with our own futile objections and requests for moderation. It was all in wondrous good fellowship, no doubt, but we would have preferred that our little friends like us not quite so much all at one time. That habit of chewing on our heads was the one thing we had hoped they had forgotten, but they hadn't. It was their favorite occupation, and our pet peeve. Up on our shoulders they would climb, grunting in most happy manner, and there sit as if they received the extreme blessing of creation, nibbling at our scalps. And really, that wasn't very complimentary to us, as they are naturally bark eaters. No doubt they were seeking the salt on our skin, but whatever the purpose, they persisted in their head chewing, whether we liked it or not. How those little rascals had grown! When at last we were able to get out of the canoe and put them on the ground, we were simply amazed at their size. True, they were not full-grown yet, as a porcupine does not reach maturity for about 3 years, but they had changed greatly from the immature little walking pincushions we had left on the island 6 months before. But we had more to do at that moment than stand and stare at a couple of porcupines. Darkness was creeping through the forest, and we had yet to establish ourselves in our cabin. "All right, you fellows," I said to them, with an assumed authority which I alone felt. "Out of the way now. We must move in this baggage, build fires, get dinner, and do a lot of things more important than playing around with you." But they had no notion of getting out of the way. In fact, they embarked upon a campaign designed to interfere with everything we wanted to do. Everywhere I wanted to step, there was a porcupine. Every suitcase or duffel bag I reached for had a porcupine on it. Every time I stooped over, one or both of them climbed up on my back, and I was picking up and putting down porcupines, chasing them away from cameras, typewriters, briefcases, and other damageable articles, stumbling over them or dancing around to keep from stepping on them, until I wished every one of their 12,000 quills was turned around and sticking in them. It is one of life's richest joys to return to a woodland cabin after an absence. The comfort, security, rest, and freedom that is represented in such a little woodland home is carried in our hearts as a memory and a promise. Now we had returned. The promises and plans of months were fulfilled. We were on our cabin doorstep once more. Again, it was like the atmosphere of a well-planned surprise party. We turned the key in the lock and stood back while the door swung open slowly. It seemed like it that 1,000 voices of memories cried, "Surprise!" There was our fireplace, which had given us so many happy hours, and now openly promised as many more. There was the kitchen, which, viewed with the Northwood's appetite, produced miracles in meals. There were our shelves of books, holding out to us measureless information, inspiration, and rich thought. And there was that quiet, which was such a contrast to the nervous, noisy, hurrying world which we had left behind. But Salt and Pepper did not permit our meditation to go far, and we stood on the doorstep for this brief moment, enjoying the sensation of our return. They suddenly dashed by our feet and into the house. They were grunting wildly, their delight at finding the door open to them. It never had been before. Maybe these human beings had learned something while they were away, for in times past we had been quite careful to keep them out of the cabin. Their home was the woods, and we did not want to create in them a taste for the unnecessary comforts our way of living might offer them. We had had sufficient experience in raising Inky in a cabin. Not an article of furniture had escaped his autograph, carved by his sharp teeth. Hence Salt and Pepper had been taught to regard the trees, or the space beneath the cabin, as their dwelling places. But the door had constituted a challenge to them. Time and again it had been shut, perhaps rudely, in their faces. It had been the place where we had disappeared when they wanted to follow us. It was the place where they stood and called, generally with success, when they wanted tasty bites of food. There was something mysterious about it. Maybe it led to another world, or to a porcupine heaven. Who would know? Hence, when they found it open, it seemed to be some grand opportunity that might knock only once. Into the door they went, not even hesitating to take a bite at the suitcases which sat close at hand, and after them we went, knowing from experience what porcupine teeth can do in a very few minutes. But they were not going to be taken easily. Outside they would have stopped immediately, anxious always for us to take them in our arms. Not so in the cabin. We reached for them and they dodged under articles of furniture. We pleaded with them, but they did not respond. We threatened them and they cared not. Under chairs, over rugs, in and out of corners, behind doors and cupboards, and the race went. Jenny and I the pursuers, they the pursued. Jenny and I were much in earnest, and the porcupines were having a wonderful time. We left the door open, hoping they would go out, but they wouldn't go near it. We offered them cookies, but they wouldn't take a bite. Instead, the little rascals ran excitedly over and under everything, biting left and right, until they finished exhausted in one corner, breathing heavily, while Jenny and I were in another corner in the same condition. At last, with tact, strategy, and a measure of good luck, Jenny caught Pepper and carried the grunting and biting animal out of doors. Salt saw the fate of his comrade and retreated under a low bed, where he established himself defensively, nose tucked between his front feet, quills bristling, tail lashing back and forth menacingly. Now I am sure getting a porcupine out from under a low bed must be one of life's most intricate problems. I would like to counsel with one of our military strategists on the matter sometime to see if he could suggest an effective approach. Salt was thoroughly conscious of his advantageous position. He knew I could come at him from only one direction, and in that direction he pointed his tail and all of his thousands of quills, and he loved the contest. He would not permit himself to be ignored, sensing the hopelessness of a direct attack. I tried letting him alone for a while, thinking he might come out. Instead, he began chewing on the bed, and slivers from its finely finished wood began dropping on the floor. This brought me into action again, much to his delight. He was playing, I knew, but my task could not have been more difficult if he had been in deadly earnest. I reached for him and got several quills in my hand for my trouble. I tried to move him with my foot, but he simply climbed on it and began chewing on my shoe. I started to push him out with a broom, but he screamed so loudly that I gave that up. Apparently, this was against the rules of this little game he had invented, and which I had to play whether I liked it or not. Jenny began preparing dinner, while I continued with my perplexing problem. If I left Salt for a moment, slivers started coming out of the bed again. Using my best porcupine talk, I coaxed him. He talked right back in his happiest grunts, but not a step did he move. With sudden inspiration, I moved the bed, but he moved right along with it. I became desperate. There seemed to be only one way to remove that porky without calling out the militia, and I realized what that was. Without further hesitation, I tore the bed apart. Desk covers, mattresses, springs, slats, railings I snatched from over him, until Salt, surprised and a bit resentful, stood in the midst of the floor fully exposed, his protective covering absolutely gone. He did not know what had happened or where to run. Seizing upon his moment of bewilderment, I picked him up and carried him outdoors in spite of his screaming, scratching, and biting. I put him on the ground and made a run for the door. So did he. I had never seen a porcupine move so fast before, but I beat him and slammed the door against his sensitive and obtrusive nose. Pepper joined him, and the two of them sat in consultation, telling us plainly what they thought of our lack of hospitality. Jenny and I were tired, very tired, as we sat at dinner. Well, anyway, I suggested, this was a mighty nice welcome the North Woods gave us. Yes, agreed Jenny, with a sigh, but just a little bit overseasoned. Too much salt and pepper. Yes, I know, I said, laughing, but we know we like them, pestiferous as they are. No doubt they will have plenty of tricks to use on us in the morning, but Salt and Pepper had no notion of waiting until morning. Chapter 2. Crunch, Crunch, and Double Crunch. For weeks we had been looking forward with joy to the rest that would be ours when we arrived at our sanctuary. We knew well the quiet and peace which awaited us. In noisy cities where sound sleep was almost impossible, we would comfort ourselves with the thought of our Northwoods home. There we would be free from the excitement and pressure of city life. There we would doze away to the lullaby of the wind in the pines. There we would know a dreamless sleep in a seamless silence. And that first night of our return, we set about to collect this promised sleep. We were right tired by the time the most necessary things had been done that first evening. We went to bed and were just entering the pearly gates of our dreamland paradise when there came a sound so penetrating it seemed to bore right into our thoughts. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Salt was chewing at the front door sill, methodically, persistently, in a way that seemed to promise that though it might take a long time, he would heroically persist until he had chewed the house down. I beat the floor vigorously with my boot. There was profound silence for a moment, and then crunch, crunch, crunch. Pepper was chewing at the back door sill at about the same pace and persistence Salt had initiated, as if she would eat her way along until she met him about the middle of the cabin. Again my boot came into service, and after the floor had received another good beating, there was quiet. For a moment we thought we had triumphed, but we had started seeking, and when we had started seeking that elusive sleep again, when came double crunch, double crunch, double crunch. Salt and Pepper were chewing a duet on their respective door sills. Now the annoyance of a porky's chewing is not measured entirely by sound. There is a threat to his nibbling that denies one any possible comfort while it is going on. Those sharp, amber-colored teeth of his can cut through anything that is not made of metal. It always seemed that he is working on the last quarter inch of the foundation of the cabin itself, and any bite may be the final one that produces a complete collapse. If the crunch, crunch, crunch were not associated with a porcupine, if it were being sung by a phonograph, likely we could ignore it, or bury our heads beneath a pillow and forget it. But because of the calamity this gnawing promises, we find ourselves propped up on our elbows, listening to it, hoping each of its gripping notes will be the last, and knowing full well that it won't be. I gave the floor several more good beatings with my boot, and thereby gained some moments of silence, but then again would come that crunch, crunch, and double crunch. There was nothing to do but get up. Certainly that is what Salt and Pepper were looking for. They didn't care a thing about those door sills. The sills had been there all winter, and they had not given them a nip. But they knew that inside those doors were their newly returned human friends. They knew they had been without our companionship long enough, and probably they knew that their gnawing sooner or later would get them the attention they wanted. Grudgingly, I went out to play with them for a while. They romped with me, climbed over me, and chewed at the back of my head. It was a lovely night, moon and stars shining, and I might have forgiven them at any other time. But now we wanted that promised sleep, that rest to which we had been looking forward. Then an idea came to me. There had been arranged for these porcupines just one place where they could go under the house. It was not a large opening, and I could easily block it. Giving them one final tussle, I gathered them up, and before they could form any possible objections, I had tucked them under the house and placed a log at the opening. Now, there they could stay until morning, and let door sills alone. Also, let us have some sleep. Again we had tiptoed almost to dreamland. The peace and silence of the forest was ours at last, when crunch, 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 yes, and double crunch too. Right under our beds they had started chewing on the floor joist. It was 100-fold more intimate and threatening than the nibbling of the door sills had been, and they interspersed the crunching with occasional conversation and calls. There were violent beatings on the floors with boots and other articles, but these gained only momentary relief. Before the new spasm had subsided, I was outside again, kneeling at the opening which led under the house, having hurriedly removed the log I had placed there, literally begging Salt and Pepper to come out and play with me, but to let the house alone. The moon had traveled far in its course across the heavens, and daylight was rather close at hand before the two pesky porcupines developed a hunger for some wild cherry twigs and climbed into a tree near the cabin. We wearily went to gather the remaining fragments for our coveted sleep. The next day came all too quickly, and with it much to be done. Salt and Pepper didn't care, though. They slept through most of the sunlight hours anyway, that they might be bright and fresh for their work on the door sills and floor joists in nights to come. When the excitement of the first several days had passed at the sanctuary, we found time to look around a bit. The forest world was sparkling with spring. Buds were swelling, grasses were greening, spring peepers calling, and bird travelers arriving and looking around energetically for accommodations. Many were making our little island their home. Perhaps they felt the safety of the place. Perhaps they were attracted by the feeding station, bird bath, and bird hotels we kept ready for their use. Maybe the rich growth of berry trees and bushes was to their liking. Whatever brought them brought us happiness too. Eagerly we watched them as they moved in. Some were old friends, some new friends. All were welcome. We saw the purple finch select the crotch of a white birch tree as a home site, and we knew that our mornings and evenings would be saturated with one of the sweetest songs of the wild wood. We saw the song sparrow eyeing with satisfaction a low balsam tree near the water's edge, and we knew that soon his bouncing, happy song would adorn the solitude. The trim little white-throated sparrow found a hollow stump to his liking. Everything already lovely in the wildwood would be made lovelier by his plaintive tweet. Poor John Peabody, Peabody, Peabody. Phoebe returned again to a favorite spot under the eaves of our boathouse, where she had nested for 3 years. An oriole chose the delicate drooping limbs of a yellow birch as the building site of her remarkable woven house. A warbling vireo moved into a wild cherry tree. An ovenbird selected the grasses on a little hillside in which to build that funny little nest that looks like a Dutch oven. Tree swallows moved into hollows in dead trees in the nearby swamp. Red-winged blackbirds nested in tangled swamp shrubbery near them. Martins entered the home prepared for them at the tip of another small island, while the inevitable robins were everywhere. Certainly we were not going to want for bird music in the weeks ahead. We were not going to want for other woodland interest either. The whole sanctuary was rich with promise. Beavers had established themselves in a little cove we called Beaver Bay. We found evidence of their presence in freshly cut trees along the shores and up the creek, and in floating sticks of aspen from which the bark had been removed by their sharp teeth. Bears were in the region of Vanishing Lake. Along the trail to the little lake were several trees having their unmistakable marks. Nature students are not in agreement as to the motive bears have in making such marks. The powerful creatures fly at a tree as if they were going to pull it to pieces. They will strike it with their ponderous paws, cut deep gashes in the bark with their claws. Not infrequently they bite into the tree savagely, growling in apparent fury, tearing out great pieces of wood. Some say this is a way of showing off before a mate. Others believe it is posting a challenge to other bears who might invade the forbidden territory. Still others believe the purpose, at least in part, is to obtain the medicinal sap of the tree, as bears are seen to come back to trees so treated and lick at the wounds they have made. Perhaps all these purposes are involved, but at least, as far as we were concerned, it was a message that these interesting animals were in our forest. Near the bear trees, there were curious marks on small balsams. These also told us a story. Long scratches ran lengthwise of the little trees, beginning at a point about 3 feet high and running almost to the ground. The autograph of a wildcat, left as the beautiful but cunning creature had yawned and stretched and reached for something on which to try his claws, even as our domestic cats do. At the base of a white spruce which towered over 100 feet high were several holes cut deeply into the tree. The holes were fully 2 inches across at the opening and reached a depth of about 3 inches into the tree. On the ground beneath them was a pile of chips, some of the slivers large enough to do credit to the gnawing of our porcupines. But this was the work of the great pileated woodpecker, which is exceeded in size only by the ivory-billed woodpecker of the south. He looks to be fully as large as a crow, his head crested with red, and there is no more happy or industrious workman in all the forest. Chanting incessantly, he bores quickly into the trees, making the chips fly and letting them fall where they may, while he feasts upon insects and grubs he is finding. What grand things we had to watch that season! What pleasure it would be to spy on these creatures, watch their ways, and maybe learn some things we had not known before. Along the north shore of our lake, one of those first days, we found the footprint of an enormous buck. Hurriedly we landed and examined the tracks. We could see where the creature had come down to water to the rink, had wandered along the sandy shore for 50 yards, and then returned on into the woods. Likely this visit had happened but a short time before. The footprints of a deer are not at all rare in those sands, and usually such markings would have drawn no more than passing notice from us. But these tracks were of deeper interest. They were tremendous in size. "The antlered king?" queried Jenny, as we noted the great spread and depth of the hoof marks. Perhaps. We could not know from tracks alone, but certainly such a track would indicate the presence of that greatest of all bucks whom we had named the antlered king. 2 years before we had seen him on several occasions. No adventure at the sanctuary was more prized than those moments when we looked upon this magnificent creature, who was so much larger than others of his kind that it seemed he might have been of another species. He was a leftover from the earlier years, when many living things of the forest were of greater strength and stature. Then a year had passed in which we did not see him at all. We feared something had happened to him. But now these tracks, had he returned? One evening, Jenny and I sat before the fireplace, making notes of the many things developing in the woodland world about us. There is so much in this great show nature is staging for us that it seemed a shame others are not here to enjoy it, I ventured with conviction. Jenny's eyes lit with interest. Yes, I continued, there should be someone with us, perhaps a youth. Someone to ask funny questions and make us think hard to give the answers. Someone to tip things over accidentally, to get in funny kinds of trouble. "You are missing Bobby, aren't you?" Jenny interrupted. I nodded. "Why, there hasn't been a thing dropped or broken or spilled since we arrived. No one has tipped over the coffee pot, no one has fallen in the lake, and no one has put salt in the sugar bowl. I tell you, it is monotonous." But Jenny was not listening to me. She had risen, walked over to the desk, and began writing a letter. I watched her, awaiting an explanation which was not to come. With an air of affected aloofness, she sealed the envelope and stamped it. "Am I to know anything about that letter?" I finally asked. "Maybe." With studied indifference, she placed the envelope in her handbag, obviously to keep me from seeing the address. "When?" "Oh, sometime." "Is something going to happen because of that letter?" I hope so. Will I like what happens? I hope so, she said. That's the end of our story time for today. I hope you'll join us tomorrow for chapter 3, same time, same place. God bless. Have a wonderful day.